into the collective consciousness of billions.
Okay, let's play some
For over
dance.
2,000 years, we've been told that concepts of heaven and hell, divine judgment,
Street
and
whore.
eternal reward emerged from the sacred traditions of Judaism and Christianity. But what if I told you that these foundational beliefs, the very bedrock of Western spirituality, were actually borrowed, adapted, and repackaged from a far older source? What if the paradise you've been promised and the damnation you've been warned about originated not in Jerusalem or Galilee, but in the windswept plateaus of ancient Persia? What if the most sacred doctrines of three major world religions were lifted wholesale from a faith that most people today have never even heard of? This isn't speculation. This isn't theory. This is documented history that religious institutions have spent centuries trying to bury. And by the time we're done here, you'll understand why they've worked so hard to keep this truth hidden. Because once you see the
Stupid!
once you trace the bloodline of these beliefs back to
Vision
their
of
true
ear,
origin,
you rook.
everything changes. Every
Cut off your
sermon
left
you've
ear.
heard, every prayer you've whispered, every fear of judgment you've carried becomes part of a much larger, much stranger story. The religion we need to talk about is Zoroastrianism, and its prophet was a man named Zoroaster, also called Zarathustra. Long before Moses received the Ten Commandments, before Christ walked the shores of Galilee, before Muhammad received his revelations in the cave of Hira, this Persian prophet introduced concepts so revolutionary, so complete, and so compelling that they would reshape human understanding of life, death, and everything that comes after. But here's where it gets interesting. Zoroaster didn't just create a religion. He engineered a theological revolution that would infiltrate and transform every major monotheistic faith that followed. And the most remarkable part, he did it so thoroughly, so completely, that for centuries, scholars, priests, and believers assumed these ideas had always been part of their own traditions. Let me paint you a picture of the world before Zoroaster. In the ancient Near East, death was simple and depressing. When you died, regardless of whether you were a saint or a sinner, a king or a peasant, your soul descended to the same shadowy underworld. The Mesopotamians called it the land of no return. The early Hebrews called it Sheol, a dull, grey place where all the dead existed as weak shadows of their former selves. There was no judgment, no reward for virtue, no punishment for vice.
Alright,
Death
fuck.
was the great equality,
Oh!
and that equality was uniformly bleak. But sometime between 1500 and 1000 BCE, in the highlands of what is now Iran, a prophet emerged with a radically different vision. Zoroaster proclaimed that death wasn't the end of moral consequence, it was the beginning. He taught that after death, every soul would face individual judgment based on their earthly deeds. The righteous would ascend to a paradise of eternal bliss, while the wicked would descend to a realm of punishment and purification. Sound familiar? It should. Because these concepts, individual judgment after death, heaven as reward for the righteous, hell as punishment for the wicked, these weren't Jewish innovations, they weren't Christian revelations, they were Persian inventions, created by Zoroaster more than 1,000 years before Christ was born. But Zoroaster didn't stop there. His theological revolution included concepts that would become absolutely fundamental to later religions. The idea of a single, all-powerful creator God, locked in cosmic battle with an evil adversary. The notion of free will and moral choice determining eternal destiny. The promise of a future resurrection of the dead and a final judgment that would end history itself. Even the concept of a saviour figure who would come to redeem humanity. All of this originated in Persia, centuries before similar ideas appeared in Jewish, Christian, or Islamic texts. The Zoroastrian afterlife wasn't a vague, abstract concept. It was a detailed, sophisticated system that mapped out exactly what happened to the soul after death. According to Zoroastrian texts, when a person died, their spirit would linger near the body for 3 days and nights, experiencing anxiety and distress from the sudden separation. During this period, divine beings would prepare an account of the soul's good works and sins, creating a kind of spiritual ledger that would determine their fate. On the fourth day, the soul would begin its journey to the afterlife, guided by a spirit called Diana, who represented conscience and moral awareness. But the path to eternity wasn't direct. Every soul, without exception, had to cross the Chinvat Bridge, the Bridge of Judgment, a narrow span that separated the world of the living from the realm of the dead. Here's where Zoroastrian theology becomes truly remarkable in its psychological sophistication. The bridge itself would transform based on the moral character of the soul attempting to cross it. For the righteous, it would become wide and stable, like a golden highway strewn with sweet-scented blossoms. Their journey would be pleasant, guided by beautiful angelic beings who would escort them to paradise. But for the wicked, the bridge would narrow to the thickness of a razor's edge. The path would become thorny, foul-smelling, and agonizing to traverse. Demonic entities would emerge to drag these souls into the abyss below, where they would face punishment in the House of Lies, the Zoroastrian hell. What made this system revolutionary wasn't just its moral complexity, but its emphasis on individual responsibility and divine justice. In the ancient world, most people believed that fate was determined by the whims of the gods, by social status, or by ritual observance. Zoroaster taught something radically different, that every person, regardless of birth or station, had the power to choose their eternal destiny through their thoughts, words, and actions. This concept of moral agency, the idea that humans are free agents capable of choosing between good and evil, and that these choices have eternal consequences, would become absolutely central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But it originated with Zoroaster in the Persian highlands, centuries before these other traditions emerged. The Zoroastrian paradise, called the House of Song, was described in terms that would later echo through Christian and Islamic visions of heaven. It was a realm of perfect light, eternal joy, and spiritual fulfillment, where the righteous would exist in harmony with the divine. The descriptions are remarkably detailed. A place of comfort, pleasure, and happiness that surpassed even the greatest earthly welfare, where there was no want, pain, or distress, but only pleasantness in an endless, boundless world of good. Conversely, Zoroastrian hell was not a place of arbitrary torment, but a realm where souls experienced consequences directly related to their earthly actions. It was described as deep and descending, dark and stinking, filled with terrible existences. But here's a crucial difference that sets Zoroastrianism apart from later traditions. The Persian hell wasn't eternal. It was reformative, designed to purify souls through appropriate punishment, before they could eventually be redeemed and reunited with the divine. This brings us to perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Zoroastrian eschatology, the doctrine of universal salvation. Unlike the later monotheistic religions that would adopt many of its concepts, Zoroastrianism taught that ultimately every soul would be saved. Even the most wicked would eventually be purified and welcomed into eternal bliss. Hell was temporary, heaven was forever. But how did these Persian concepts migrate into Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought? The answer lies in one of history's most consequential political events, the Babylonian exile and the subsequent Persian conquest of Babylon. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire destroyed Jerusalem and carried the Jewish elite into captivity. For nearly 50 years, the Jewish people lived in exile, their temple destroyed, their homeland occupied, their future uncertain. Then, in 539 BCE, everything changed. Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and issued an unprecedented decree. All captive peoples could return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. For the Jews, this was nothing short of miraculous, but the Persian generosity came with consequences that would reshape Judaism forever. During their exile and the subsequent period of Persian rule, Jewish thinkers were exposed to Zoroastrian ideas on a massive scale. Persian officials, priests, and settlers brought their religious concepts into direct contact with Jewish theology. The result was a theological revolution that would transform Judaism from a relatively simple, tribal religion into something far more complex and universal. The evidence for this transformation is striking. Before the Babylonian exile, Jewish texts contain almost no references to individual judgment after death, heaven and hell, or resurrection of the dead. The Hebrew Bible's earliest texts describe death in terms remarkably similar to other ancient Near Eastern traditions. All the dead descend to Sheol, a shadowy underworld where they exist as weak spirits, regardless of their earthly behavior. But after the exile, during the Second Temple period, Jewish literature suddenly explodes with detailed descriptions of afterlife judgment, heavenly rewards, hellish punishments, and resurrection at the end of time. These concepts appear so abruptly and fully formed that scholars have long recognized they must have been borrowed from an outside source. And that source was Zoroastrianism. The linguistic evidence is particularly compelling.
Are you saying,
One of the
Pagan?
Hebrew words for paradise, pardes, is a direct borrowing from the Persian paradisa, meaning enclosed garden. This isn't speculation, it's documented etymology. The very word Jews and Christians use to describe heaven comes from Persian, but the borrowing went far beyond vocabulary. The entire conceptual framework of the afterlife would become central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Individual judgment, moral consequences extending beyond death, resurrection of the body, final cosmic battle between good and evil, and the ultimate triumph of righteousness. All of these ideas can be traced directly to Zoroastrian sources that predate their appearance in Jewish texts by centuries. This wasn't a gradual process of influence or a subtle theological evolution. It was a wholesale adoption of foreign religious concepts that fundamentally transformed Jewish understanding of death, judgment, and eternal destiny. And once these Persian ideas were integrated into Judaism, they would spread through Christianity and Islam to shape the religious consciousness of billions of people worldwide. The implications of this are staggering. The heaven you've been promised, the hell you've been warned about, the judgment you've been told awaits you after death. These aren't ancient Hebrew revelations or Christian innovations. They're Persian imports, adapted and repackaged by later religious traditions that have spent centuries claiming them as their own original insights. But why has this history been obscured? Why don't more people know that the fundamental concepts of the afterlife in Western religion originated in ancient Persia? The answer lies in the politics of religious authority and the uncomfortable questions that this knowledge raises about the originality and divine inspiration of supposedly revealed texts. Religious institutions have always derived their authority partly from claims of mute revelation and original insight. The idea that core doctrines were borrowed from earlier, foreign sources undermines these claims and raises troubling questions about the nature of religious truth. If heaven and hell came from Persia, what else might have been borrowed? If fundamental theological concepts migrated between cultures, how do we determine which religious tradition, if any, has access to ultimate truth? These questions become even more complex when we consider the sophisticated theological framework that Zoroaster created. This wasn't a primitive or simplistic belief system that was later refined by Jewish and Christian thinkers. Zoroastrianism was already remarkably developed, with detailed cosmology, complex angelology and demonology, sophisticated concepts of free will and moral responsibility, and a comprehensive vision of cosmic history that included creation, cosmic battle, and ultimate redemption. In many ways, what Zoroaster accomplished was even more impressive than what later religious founders would achieve. Moses received laws and commandments, but Zoroaster created an entire metaphysical system. Jesus preached about the kingdom of heaven, but Zoroaster had already mapped out its geography centuries earlier. Muhammad spoke of Judgment Day, but Zoroaster had already described the cosmic courtroom vividly. This raises a profound question that cuts to the heart of religious authenticity. If these later prophets were receiving divine revelations, why were those revelations so remarkably similar to ideas that had already been circulating in Persian culture for centuries? Either God was remarkably repetitive in his communications, or something else was happening, something that religious authorities had been reluctant to acknowledge. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the specific mechanisms through which these Persian concepts entered Jewish thought. It wasn't a mysterious process or a miraculous convergence of ideas. It was direct cultural transmission through documented historical channels that we can trace with remarkable precision. During the Persian period, which lasted from 539 to 332 BCE, the Jewish community wasn't just living under Persian rule. They were actively collaborating with Persian administrators, intermarrying with Persian families, and participating in Persian religious and cultural life. Persian officials governed Jewish territories. Persian priests conducted ceremonies that Jews witnessed. Persian religious texts circulated in communities where Jewish scribes and scholars lived and worked. This wasn't casual contact or peripheral influence. This was deep, sustained, intimate exposure to Zoroastrian theology over a period of more than 2 centuries. Jewish religious leaders weren't just aware of Persian beliefs, they were living and breathing in a Persian religious atmosphere that permeated every aspect of their daily lives. And the influence flowed in very specific directions that we can document. Before Persian contact, Jewish texts show no evidence of belief in individual afterlife judgment, detailed concepts of heaven and hell, or expectations of bodily resurrection. These concepts appear suddenly and fully formed in Jewish literature during and after the Persian period, often using Persian terminology and reflecting Persian theological frameworks. The Book of Daniel, written during this period, contains some of the Hebrew Bible's most detailed descriptions of afterlife judgment and resurrection. These passages read like Zoroastrian texts translated into Hebrew, complete with Persian cosmological concepts and Persian terminology for spiritual beings and afterlife destinations. But perhaps the most striking evidence comes from the development of Jewish angelology and demonology during this period. Early Jewish texts contain virtually no references to named angels beyond the most general terms. But during the Persian period, Jewish literature suddenly explodes with detailed hierarchies of angelic beings, each with specific names, functions, and attributes that correspond remarkably closely to Zoroastrian spiritual entities. The angel Michael, who becomes central to Jewish and Christian tradition as a warrior against evil, bears striking resemblance to the Zoroastrian Yazata Mitra, who serves as judge of souls and cosmic warrior for truth. The concept of Satan as a specific adversary of God, rather than simply a generic term for opposition, emerges during this period and reflects Persian concepts of Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit who opposes divine will.
I got my spoon out
These
by
weren't
the
subtle
car.
influences or vague parallels. These were direct borrowings of specific theological concepts, often retaining Persian names and attributes, even as they were integrated into Jewish religious thought. The evidence is so clear and overwhelming that even traditionally conservative biblical scholars have been forced to acknowledge Persian influence on Jewish eschatology, even if they remain reluctant to discuss the full implications of that influence. But the story doesn't end with Judaism. When Christianity emerged from its Jewish matrix, it inherited all of these Persian-derived concepts and amplified them even further. The Christian vision of heaven and hell, individual judgment after death, resurrection of the body, and cosmic battle between good and evil. All of these core Christian doctrines trace directly back to Zoroastrian sources through their Jewish intermediaries. Jesus himself, according to the Gospel accounts, spoke constantly about themes that would have been completely foreign to pre-exilic Jewish thought, but were perfectly familiar to anyone acquainted with Persian theology.
Now fuck him and take that
Kingdom
knife.
of heaven, eternal punishment for the
Now we
wicked,
dick up your
resurrection at the end of time, final judgment based on moral behaviour. These weren't revolutionary new revelations. They were Persian concepts that had been circulating in Jewish communities for centuries. The Apostle Paul, who did more than anyone else to shape early Christian theology, was deeply influenced by Persian dualistic concepts that had entered Judaism during the Persian period. His letters are filled with language about cosmic warfare between spiritual forces of good and evil, concepts that make perfect sense within the Zoroastrian framework, but would have been alien to earlier Jewish thought. Even the Christian concept of Jesus as a saviour figure who would come to redeem humanity and defeat evil bears remarkable resemblance to the Zoroastrian Saoshyant, a future saviour who would resurrect the dead, judge the living, and establish divine rule on earth. The parallels are so specific and detailed that they can't be explained as coincidental convergence or universal religious themes. Christianity didn't just borrow Persian concepts, it systematized and universalized them, creating a theological framework that would spread these originally Persian ideas throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. What had begun as Zoroastrian innovations in ancient Persia became the foundation of Christian belief throughout Europe, Africa, and eventually the entire world. The process continued when Islam emerged in the 7th century CE. Muhammad and the early Muslim community were exposed to both Jewish and Christian interpretations of Persian-derived concepts, and they incorporated many of these ideas into Islamic theology. The Quranic descriptions of paradise and hell, individual judgment after death, resurrection at the end of time, and cosmic battle between truth and falsehood all reflect the same Persian theological heritage, filtered through Jewish and Christian sources. The Islamic paradise, with its detailed descriptions of gardens, flowing rivers, and eternal bliss for the righteous, bears unmistakable resemblance to Zoroastrian descriptions of the House of Song. The Islamic hell, with its multiple levels of punishment corresponding to different degrees of wickedness, reflects Persian concepts of graduated judgment and moral consequences. Even the Islamic concept of the bridge over hell that souls must cross, the Sirat, is directly parallel to the Zoroastrian Chimba bridge. What we're looking at here isn't just influence or inspiration. This is wholesale theological appropriation on a scale that's almost unprecedented in religious history. Three major world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, built their most fundamental doctrines about life, death, and eternity on foundations that were laid by a Persian prophet more than 1,000 years before any of them existed as distinct religious traditions. The implications go far beyond academic interest in religious history. This knowledge fundamentally challenges the way we understand religious authority, divine revelation, and the nature of spiritual truth itself. If the core beliefs about afterlife judgment that have shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia originated not with Hebrew prophets, or Christian apostles, or Islamic revelation, but with a Persian religious innovator, whose name most people don't even recognize, what does that tell us about the claims these traditions make for their own uniqueness and divine authorization? Religious institutions have spent enormous effort constructing narratives of original revelation, unique divine inspiration, and exclusive access to spiritual truth. The discovery that their most fundamental doctrines were borrowed from earlier sources doesn't necessarily invalidate those claims, but it certainly complicates them in ways that make religious authorities profoundly uncomfortable. This discomfort helps explain why the Persian origins of heaven and hell remain relatively unknown despite being well documented in scholarly literature. It's not that the evidence is hidden or suppressed. It's readily available to anyone who looks for it. But religious communities have little incentive to publicize information that raises uncomfortable questions about the originality of their core beliefs. The result is a kind of collective amnesia about one of the most important religious developments in human history. Zoroaster's theological innovations shaped the spiritual consciousness of billions of people. Yet most of those people have never heard his name. The concepts he developed became so thoroughly integrated into later religious traditions that they're now considered fundamental to those traditions, rather than being recognized as Persian contributions to human religious thought. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story isn't just the borrowing of concepts, it's how those concepts were transformed and adapted as they moved from one cultural context to another. The Zoroastrian vision of temporary hell and universal salvation became, in Christian hands, a doctrine of eternal damnation for the unrepentant. The Persian emphasis on individual moral choice became, in some Islamic interpretations, a more complex theology of divine predestination and human responsibility. Each religious tradition took the Persian raw materials and crafted them into something that served their particular theological and cultural needs. But the foundation remained the same. The basic architecture of afterlife judgment, moral consequences extending beyond death, and cosmic battle between good and evil that Zoroaster had constructed in ancient Persia. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the power or meaning of these concepts. If anything, it makes them more remarkable by showing how compelling and universal these ideas prove to be. Zoroaster's vision of moral accountability, divine justice, and ultimate redemption spoke to something so fundamental in human nature that it transcended cultural and linguistic barriers to become the spiritual foundation for half of humanity. But it does force us to reconsider our assumptions about religious originality and divine revelation. The next time you hear a sermon about heaven and hell, the next time you read about Judgment Day, the next time you contemplate what might await you after death, remember that these concepts have a history, and that history begins not in Jerusalem or Bethlehem or Mecca, but in the ancient highlands of Persia, with a prophet whose revolutionary vision of divine justice and eternal consequence changed the world forever. The question we're left with isn't whether these concepts are true or false, meaningful or empty. The question is whether we're brave enough to acknowledge where they really came from, and what that acknowledgement might mean for how we understand the nature of religious truth itself. The story becomes even more extraordinary when we examine the specific mechanisms through which Persian theological concepts not only influenced later religions, but actually replaced their original beliefs entirely. This wasn't gradual evolution or subtle theological development. This was systematic replacement of one religious worldview with another, so complete that the original beliefs were almost entirely erased from memory. Consider what Jewish thought looked like before Persian contact. The earliest Hebrew texts describe a radically different understanding of death and the afterlife. In the book of Genesis, when the patriarchs die, they are simply gathered to their people. There's no mention of judgment, no description of different destinations for the righteous and wicked, no concept of eternal reward or punishment. Death is described as a return to dust, nothing more. The book of Job, one of the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible, contains perhaps the clearest expression of pre-Persian Jewish beliefs about death. Job declares that humans lie down and do not rise again, and that the dead will not awake or be roused from their sleep. This isn't poetic metaphor, it's a literal description of death as permanent, final, and uniform for all people, regardless of their moral character. Even more telling is the way early Hebrew texts describe Sheol, the destination of all the dead. It's not a place of punishment for the wicked, or reward for the righteous. It's simply where everyone goes when they die. The Hebrew word itself suggests nothing more than a pit or grave. There's no moral dimension, no divine judgment, no differentiation based on earthly behavior. But watch what happens to Jewish thought after sustained contact with Persian theology. Suddenly, texts begin appearing that describe elaborate systems of afterlife judgment, detailed visions of paradise and hell, and complex theological frameworks for understanding moral consequences beyond death. The Book of Daniel, written during the height of Persian influence, reads like a completely different religion from the earlier Hebrew texts. The transformation is so dramatic that scholars have identified what they call the Persian period revolution in Jewish thought. Within the span of just a few centuries, Judaism went from having virtually no developed afterlife theology to possessing one of the most sophisticated eschatological systems in the ancient world. And every major element of this new system can be traced directly to Persian sources. This wasn't borrowing or adaptation. This was wholesale theological replacement. The old Hebrew understanding of death as final and uniform was abandoned in favor of Persian concepts of individual judgment and eternal consequences. The ancient Israelite acceptance of death as natural conclusion was replaced with Persian visions of cosmic battle and ultimate victory over mortality itself. The evidence for this transformation goes beyond textual analysis. Archaeological discoveries have revealed the extent to which Persian religious symbols, artistic motifs, and architectural elements were integrated into Jewish religious sites during this period. Persian fire altars appear in Jewish contexts. Persian religious imagery decorates Jewish artifacts. Persian theological terminology enters Hebrew religious vocabulary. What we're looking at is cultural and religious transformation on a scale that's almost unprecedented in recorded history. An entire people's understanding of life, death, and divine justice was fundamentally altered through contact with a foreign religious system. And the alterations were so thorough, so complete, that within a few generations, the new beliefs were considered ancient Jewish traditions rather than recent Persian imports. The psychological mechanisms behind this transformation are fascinating to consider. When the Jewish elite were carried into Babylonian exile, they faced a profound theological crisis. Their temple had been destroyed, their land occupied, their covenant with God apparently broken. The traditional Hebrew understanding of divine justice, that the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer in this life, had been shattered by historical events that seemed to prove the opposite. Into this crisis of faith came Persian theology, with its sophisticated answers to questions that Jewish thought couldn't address. Why do the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper? Because true justice occurs after death, when souls face individual judgment based on their moral choices. Why does evil seem to triumph over good? Because this world is a battlefield where cosmic forces of light and darkness struggle for supremacy, but ultimate victory is assured for those who choose righteousness. These weren't just theological concepts, they were psychological salvation for a traumatized people trying to make sense of their suffering. Persian theology provided meaning, hope, and a moral framework that traditional Hebrew thought simply couldn't offer. No wonder it was embraced so completely and so quickly. But the transformation went beyond crisis response. Persian theology was simply more sophisticated, more complete, and more emotionally satisfying than the religious concepts it replaced. The Persian vision of cosmic purpose, individual significance, and ultimate justice appealed to something fundamental in human psychology that earlier Hebrew thought had left unaddressed. Consider the psychological difference between the two systems. Traditional Hebrew thought told people that their moral choices mattered in this life, but that death was the same for everyone, regardless of how they lived. Persian theology told people that every moral choice had eternal significance, that individual lives mattered on a cosmic scale, and ultimate justice was not only possible, but inevitable. From a purely human perspective, which system would be more appealing? Which would provide more motivation for moral behavior? Which would offer more comfort in the face of suffering and injustice? The answer is obvious, and it helps explain why Persian concepts spread so rapidly and completely through Jewish communities during the Persian period. The integration process was facilitated by the political and social realities of Persian rule. Unlike many ancient empires that imposed their religious beliefs through force, the Persian Empire practiced a policy of religious tolerance that allowed conquered peoples to maintain their traditional beliefs while exposing them to Persian theological concepts. This created an environment where religious ideas could mix and merge naturally without the resistance that would have accompanied forced conversion. Persian administrators worked alongside Jewish leaders. Persian priests conducted ceremonies that Jewish communities witnessed. Persian religious festivals were celebrated in cities where Jewish populations lived. This wasn't superficial contact. It was deep, sustained, intimate exposure to Persian religious thought over multiple generations. The result was a kind of theological synthesis that preserved Jewish identity and traditional practices while fundamentally altering Jewish understanding of cosmic purpose and individual destiny. Jews continued to see themselves as God's chosen people, but they now understood their chosenness within a Persian framework of cosmic battle between good and evil. They maintained their traditional laws and customs, but they now believed these practices had consequences that extended far beyond this life. This synthesis was so successful that it became the foundation for all subsequent Jewish theological development. The Judaism that emerged from the Persian period wasn't the same religion that had entered Babylonian exile. It was a new creation that combined Hebrew tradition with Persian innovation to produce something unprecedented in human religious history. When Christianity emerged from this Persian-influenced Judaism, it took the synthesis even further. Jesus spoke about the kingdom of heaven using concepts and terminology that were thoroughly Persian in origin, though they had been mediated through centuries of Jewish theological development. The Christian emphasis on individual salvation, eternal judgment, and cosmic battle between good and evil all reflect this Persian heritage. Paul's letters, which shape Christian theology more than any other single source, are saturated with Persian dualistic concepts that had entered Christian thought through their Jewish matrix. His descriptions of spiritual warfare, his emphasis on moral choice and eternal consequence, his vision of cosmic redemption, all of these core Christian ideas trace back through Jewish intermediaries to Persian origins. The Gospel of John, often considered the most theologically sophisticated of the Christian texts, reads like a Persian theological treatise, translated into Greek, and given a Christian narrative framework. Its emphasis on light versus darkness, truth versus falsehood, and eternal life versus spiritual death all reflect Persian theological categories that have become so thoroughly integrated into Jewish thought that they seem like natural Christian developments. Even the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, while developed much later than the Gospel period, reflects Persian theological concepts about the relationship between divine unity and spiritual multiplicity. The Persian understanding of Ahura Mazda as ultimate divine reality, expressing itself through various spiritual entities, provided a conceptual framework that made Christian Trinitarian theology possible. This Persian influence continued to shape Christian thought throughout its formative centuries. The early Christian debates about the nature of evil, the relationship between divine sovereignty and human free will, and the ultimate destiny of creation all took place within intellectual frameworks that had been established by Persian theology centuries earlier. The Church Fathers who developed classical Christian doctrine were working with theological raw materials that were fundamentally Persian in origin, even though they had been processed through Jewish and early Christian sources. Augustine's understanding of divine justice, Jerome's vision of afterlife judgment, John Chrysostom's concept of moral accountability. All of these foundational Christian ideas reflect Persian theological DNA that had been transmitted through generations of religious development. The influence became so pervasive that it's difficult to identify any major Christian doctrine about the afterlife, divine judgment, or cosmic purpose that doesn't reflect Persian theological concepts. The Christian heaven, with its emphasis on eternal bliss for the righteous, is recognizably descended from the Zoroastrian house of song. The Christian hell, with its eternal punishment for the unrepentant, reflects Persian concepts of moral consequence, though Christianity made the punishment permanent in ways that Zoroastrianism did not. The Christian emphasis on individual moral choice and personal responsibility for salvation directly reflects Persian theological innovations that had been unknown in earlier religious systems. The Christian expectation of bodily resurrection and final judgment represents Persian concepts that had been integrated so thoroughly into Jewish thought that they seemed like natural Christian developments rather than foreign imports. Even Christian angelology and demonology, which became increasingly elaborate during the medieval period, developed along lines that had been established by Persian theology. The Christian hierarchy of angelic beings, with specific names, functions, and attributes, mirrors Zoroastrian spiritual hierarchies in ways that can't be explained as coincidental convergence. The process continued when Islam emerged in the 7th century. Muhammad and the early Muslim community inherited Persian theological concepts through both Jewish and Christian channels, creating an Islamic synthesis that preserved and transmitted Persian innovations to new cultural contexts. The Quranic descriptions of paradise, with their detailed imagery of gardens, flowing rivers, and eternal pleasure for the righteous, reflect Persian theological concepts that had been transmitted through Jewish and Christian sources. The Islamic emphasis on individual judgment after death, with souls crossing a bridge over hell before reaching their eternal destination, represents a direct continuation of Persian theological innovation. Islamic angelology and demonology, with their elaborate hierarchies of spiritual beings and detailed descriptions of cosmic warfare between good and evil, continue Persian theological traditions that had been developing for over a millennium by the time Islam emerged. Even Islamic concepts of divine unity and spiritual multiplicity reflect Persian theological frameworks that had shaped Jewish and Christian thought for centuries. The result is that the three major monotheistic religions of the world all share a common Persian theological heritage that most of their adherents don't even recognize. The heaven they hope for, the hell they fear, the judgment they expect after death. All of these concepts originated not with their own prophets and scriptures, but with a Persian religious innovator whose theological vision proved so compelling that it conquered the spiritual imagination of half of humanity. This raises profound questions about the nature of religious truth and the mechanisms of divine revelation. If core religious concepts can migrate between cultures so completely that their origins are forgotten, what does that tell us about the relationship between human religious creativity and divine inspiration? If theological innovations can be so thoroughly integrated into later religious traditions that they're considered original to those traditions, how do we evaluate claims of unique revelation and exclusive divine authorization? These aren't just academic questions. They go to the heart of how we understand religious authority, spiritual truth, and the development of human religious consciousness. The Persian origins of heaven and hell force us to confront uncomfortable realities about the way religious traditions develop, preserve their authority, and present their historical claims. Religious institutions have powerful incentives to maintain narratives of original revelation and unique divine inspiration. Acknowledging that core doctrines were borrowed from earlier sources undermines these narratives in ways that could threaten institutional authority and believer confidence. This helps explain why the Persian origins of these concepts remain relatively unknown, despite being well documented in scholarly literature. The silence isn't the result of conspiracy or deliberate suppression. It's the natural consequence of religious communities emphasizing information that supports their authority claims, while de-emphasizing information that complicates those claims. The result is a kind of selective historical memory that preserves institutional narratives while obscuring inconvenient historical realities. But the historical evidence is too clear and too overwhelming to ignore indefinitely. The Persian origins of heaven and hell represent one of the most important and least understood chapters in human religious development. Understanding this history doesn't necessarily invalidate later religious claims, but it certainly changes how we evaluate them. Perhaps most importantly, recognizing the Persian origins of these concepts helps us appreciate the remarkable achievement of Zoroaster and the Persian religious tradition he founded. This wasn't a primitive or simplistic belief system that was later refined by more sophisticated religious thinkers. Zoroastrianism was already remarkably developed, with complex theology, sophisticated understanding of human psychology, and compelling vision of cosmic purpose and individual significance. Zoroaster's theological innovations were so profound and so complete that they provided the conceptual framework within which most subsequent religious development in the Western world would take place. The questions he asked, the problems he identified, and the solutions he proposed became the foundation for religious thought that would eventually shape the consciousness of billions of people worldwide. The heaven you've been promised, the hell you've been warned about, the judgment you've been told awaits you after death. These aren't just religious concepts. They're monuments to one of the most creative and influential minds in human history. A Persian prophet whose theological vision was so compelling that it transcended every cultural and linguistic barrier to become the spiritual foundation of Western civilization. The story of how these concepts migrated from ancient Persia to modern religious consciousness is still being written. Each generation of believers adds new interpretations, new applications, and new understanding to theological concepts that began with Zoroaster more than 2.5 millennia ago. But the foundation remains the same. The basic architecture of divine justice, individual moral responsibility, and ultimate cosmic purpose that was first articulated by a Persian prophet whose name most people don't even recognize. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the power or meaning of these concepts. If anything, it makes them more remarkable by showing how universal and compelling they prove to be. But it does force us to reconsider our assumptions about religious originality, divine revelation, and the nature of spiritual truth itself. The Persian origins of heaven and hell represent more than just an interesting footnote in religious history. They represent a fundamental challenge to how we understand the development of human religious consciousness and the relationship between cultural innovation and spiritual truth. Whether we're ready to accept that challenge remains to be seen. But there's another dimension to this story that makes it even more extraordinary and more unsettling for those who prefer simple narratives about religious truth. Because while Persian concepts were being absorbed into Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, something else was happening to Zoroastrianism itself. The religion that had given birth to the evolutionary ideas was slowly disappearing from history, its contributions forgotten, its innovations claimed by others. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of political forces, religious persecution, and what can only be described as systematic theological appropriation on an unprecedented scale. The Persian Empire that had been so tolerant of other religions, so generous in allowing conquered peoples to maintain their beliefs, found itself conquered in turn. And the conquerors weren't nearly so tolerant. When Alexander the Great swept through Persia in 334 BCE, he didn't just defeat Persian armies, he systematically destroyed Persian religious institutions. Zoroastrian fire temples were razed, sacred texts were burned, priests were killed or scattered. The Greek historian Plutarch records that Alexander ordered the destruction of Persian religious manuscripts, claiming they contained dangerous magical knowledge that threatened Greek civilization. But Alexander's destruction was nothing compared to what came later. When Arab armies conquered Persia in the 7th century CE, bringing Islam with them, they launched what amounted to a theological war against Zoroastrianism. Fire temples were converted to mosques. Zoroastrian priests were forced to convert or face death. Sacred texts that had preserved Persian religious knowledge for over a millennium were systematically destroyed. The irony is almost too bitter to contemplate. Islam which had inherited its core concepts of heaven, hell, and divine judgment from Persian sources, was now destroying the very tradition that had given birth to these ideas. The religion that owed its theological foundation to Zoroastrian innovation was systematically eradicating Zoroastrianism from the lands where it had originated. By the 10th century CE, Zoroastrianism had been reduced from the state religion of one of history's greatest empires to a tiny minority struggling for survival. Most Zoroastrians fled to India, where they became known as Parsis, literally meaning Persians, and maintained their traditions in exile. Those who remained in Persia faced constant persecution, forced conversion, and cultural extinction. The result was one of history's most successful cases of religious erasure. Within a few centuries, the religion that had revolutionized human understanding of the afterlife had been almost completely eliminated from public consciousness. Its temples were gone, its priests silenced, its texts destroyed. The theological concepts it had created lived on, but divorced from their origins, claimed by other traditions as their own original revelations. This erasure wasn't just physical, it was intellectual and cultural. As Persian religious texts disappeared, so did knowledge of Persian theological innovations. Later religious scholars working within Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions had no access to Zoroastrian sources that might have revealed the true origins of their own beliefs. They naturally assumed that concepts like heaven and hell had originated within their own religious traditions, because they had no way of knowing otherwise. The few Zoroastrian texts that survived were either hidden away in Parsi communities in India, or existed in languages that most Western scholars couldn't read. It wasn't until the 19th century, when European Orientalists began studying Persian religious texts systematically, that the true scope of Zoroastrian influence on later religions became apparent. Even then, the implications were slow to be recognized. Early scholars who identified Persian influences on Jewish and Christian thought were often dismissed or marginalized by religious institutions that had no interest in acknowledging foreign sources for their core doctrines. The evidence was there, but the will to examine honestly was lacking. The breakthrough came gradually, as more Persian texts were translated and studied, as archaeological evidence accumulated, and as scholars developed more sophisticated methods for tracing religious influences across cultures and time periods. By the 20th century, the Persian origins of heaven and hell were well established in academic circles, even if they remained largely unknown to the general public. But even academic recognition came with limitations. Scholars could document the influences, trace the connections, and demonstrate the borrowings, but they were often reluctant to draw the full implications of their discoveries, saying that Jewish, Christian, and Islamic concepts of the afterlife showed Persian influence was one thing. Saying that these concepts were fundamentally Persian innovations that had been appropriated by later religions was quite another. The difference matters enormously. Influence suggests partial borrowing, gradual adaptation, creative synthesis. Appropriation suggests wholesale adoption, systematic replacement, intellectual theft. The evidence supports the stronger interpretation, but the stronger interpretation raises uncomfortable questions about religious authenticity that many scholars prefer to avoid. Meanwhile, the theological concepts that had originated with Zoroaster continued to evolve within the traditions that had adopted them. Christianity developed increasingly elaborate visions of heaven and hell, complete with detailed geographic descriptions and complex systems of rewards and punishments. Medieval Christian writers like Dante created literary masterpieces that presented Persian theological concepts as Christian revelations, further cementing the perception that these ideas had always been part of Christian tradition. Islamic scholars developed equally sophisticated eschatological systems, with detailed descriptions of paradise and hell that reflected Persian theological frameworks while being presented as purely Islamic innovations. The Quran's descriptions of afterlife judgment with souls crossing bridges over hell before reaching their eternal destinations, were understood as divine revelations rather than continuations of Persian theological traditions. Jewish mystical traditions like Kabbalah developed complex angelologies and demonologies that drew heavily on Persian spiritual hierarchies, while presenting these systems as ancient Hebrew wisdom. The idea that fundamental Jewish concepts about spiritual beings and cosmic warfare might have Persian origins was simply not considered. Each tradition elaborated on the Persian foundation in ways that reflected their particular cultural contexts and theological needs. But the foundation remained recognizably Persian for anyone who knew how to look for it. The basic architecture of individual judgment, moral consequences extending beyond death, and cosmic battle between good and evil that Zoroaster had constructed remained intact beneath all the later elaborations. This process of elaboration and cultural adaptation helps explain why the Persian origins of these concepts remained hidden for so long. By the time European scholars began studying comparative religion systematically, the original Persian theological concepts had been so thoroughly integrated into later traditions and so extensively developed within those traditions that they seemed like natural outgrowths of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought rather than foreign imports. The situation was complicated further by the fact that Zoroastrianism itself had not remained static. The Persian religion continued to develop and change over the centuries, responding to Greek philosophical influences, absorbing elements from other religious traditions, and adapting to new political and cultural circumstances. By the time scholars began comparing Zoroastrian and later religious texts, both traditions had evolved significantly from their original forms. This made it difficult to trace influences and establish clear lines of theological development. Scholars could see that Persian and later religious concepts were remarkably similar, but determining which tradition had influenced which, and in what direction the influences had flowed, required careful analysis of textual evidence, historical context, and chronological development. The work was further complicated by the fact that most Persian religious texts had been destroyed or lost over the centuries. Scholars working on these questions often had to piece together Persian theological concepts from fragmentary sources, later commentaries, and texts that had been preserved in translation rather than in their original languages. Despite these challenges, the evidence for Persian influence on later religious traditions became increasingly overwhelming as more texts were discovered and analysed. The parallels weren't just general similarities that might be explained as universal religious themes. They were specific, detailed correspondences that could only be explained as direct cultural transmission. The vocabulary was often identical, with Persian religious terms appearing in Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic religious texts. The conceptual frameworks were parallel, with complex theological systems showing point-by-point correspondence between Persian and later sources. Even the narrative structures were similar, with stories about afterlife judgment, cosmic warfare, and divine redemption following patterns that had been established in Persian religious literature centuries earlier. The accumulation of evidence eventually reached a tipping point where denial became impossible. By the late 20th century, most serious scholars of comparative religion accepted that Persian theological concepts had profoundly influenced Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought. The only remaining questions concerned the extent and mechanisms of that influence. But academic acceptance didn't translate into popular awareness. Religious communities continued to present their theological concepts as original revelations rather than Persian inheritances. Religious education continued to ignore Persian contributions to their traditions. Popular religious literature continued to trace concepts like heaven and hell to Hebrew prophets and Christian apostles, rather than to Persian religious innovators. The result is that most believers today remain unaware that their most fundamental beliefs about death, judgment, and eternity originated in ancient Persia. They've inherited Persian theological concepts through Jewish, Christian, and Islamic intermediaries, but they have no idea where those concepts actually came from. They're practicing Persian religion without knowing it. This ignorance isn't entirely accidental. Religious institutions have powerful incentives to maintain narratives of original revelation and unique divine inspiration. Acknowledging Persian origins for core theological concepts and complicate these narratives in ways that could undermine institutional authority and belief confidence. There's also a deeper psychological dimension to consider. For believers who have built their spiritual lives around concepts of heaven and hell, discovering that these concepts originated in a foreign religious tradition can be profoundly disorienting. It raises questions not just about theological accuracy, but about personal identity and spiritual authenticity. If the heaven you've been promised and the hell you've been warned about originated in ancient Persia, rather than in your own religious tradition, what does that mean for your faith? If the judgment you expect after death reflects Persian rather than Hebrew or Christian or Islamic concepts, how do you evaluate the true claims of your own religious community? These aren't easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. But they're questions that anyone seriously interested in understanding the nature of religious truth needs to confront. The Persian origins of heaven and hell aren't just historical curiosities. They're challenges to fundamental assumptions about religious authenticity and divine revelation. The challenge becomes even more pointed when we consider the sophisticated theological framework that Zoroaster created. This wasn't a primitive belief system that was later refined and improved by more advanced religious thinkers. In many ways, Zoroastrian theology was more sophisticated, more psychologically astute, and more morally compelling than the religious systems that borrowed from it. Zoroaster's emphasis on individual moral responsibility, his vision of cosmic purpose and meaning, his promise of ultimate justice and universal redemption, these weren't just theological concepts. They were solutions to fundamental human problems that earlier religious traditions had been unable to address effectively. The Hebrew Bible's older texts offer little comfort to people suffering injustice in this life. If the righteous and wicked both descend to the same shadowy Sheol after death, what motivation is there for moral behavior?
Amen.
If there's no compensation for earthly suffering, no ultimate accountability for earthly evil, what hope can religion offer to those who need it most? Zoroaster provided answers to these questions that were both emotionally satisfying and intellectually coherent. His vision of individual judgment after death gave cosmic significance to every moral choice. His promise of heaven for the righteous offered hope to those who suffered unjustly in this life. His guarantee of hell for the wicked provided assurance that evil would ultimately be held accountable. These weren't just theological innovations. They were psychological and social innovations that addressed fundamental human needs that earlier religious systems had left unmet. The reason Persian concepts spread so rapidly and completely through later religious traditions wasn't just historical accident or cultural influence. It was because these concepts provided better answers to universal human questions than the religious ideas they replaced. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of religious progress and development. If Persian theological concepts were superior to the ideas they replaced, what does that tell us about the relationship between religious innovation and divine revelation? If human creativity could produce theological insights that were more compelling and more effective than supposedly revealed truths, how do we evaluate claims of divine inspiration? The questions become even more complex when we consider the moral dimensions of theological appropriation. If Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions built their core doctrines on Persian foundations, while systematically erasing knowledge of those foundations, is that simple cultural evolution or something more problematic? There's no question that the later religious traditions developed Persian concepts in creative and meaningful ways. Christianity's emphasis on divine love, Islam's focus on social justice, Judaism's commitment to ethical monotheism, all of these represent genuine theological innovations that went beyond what Zoroastrianism had achieved. But the foundational concepts, individual judgment after death, heaven and hell as moral destinations, cosmic battle between good and evil, ultimate divine justice. These remain fundamentally Persian in origin, even as they were elaborated within later religious frameworks. The question is whether appropriating these concepts while erasing their origins crosses a line from legitimate cultural development to something more ethically questionable. The answer probably depends on whether the appropriation was conscious and deliberate or unconscious and gradual. If later religious leaders knowingly borrowed Persian concepts while claiming them as original revelations, that would constitute intellectual and spiritual dishonesty on a massive scale. But if the borrowing occurred gradually, through natural cultural processes that obscure the original sources, it might be more accurately described as historical evolution rather than deliberate deception. The evidence suggests that the process was largely unconscious and gradual, at least in its early stages. Jewish communities during the Persian period probably didn't set out to replace their traditional beliefs with Persian concepts. The integration likely occurred naturally, as Persian theological ideas proved more useful than the concepts they gradually displaced. But later, religious authorities who had access to historical knowledge about these influences bear more responsibility for the continued erasure of Persian contributions. Medieval Christian scholars, who could have acknowledged Persian influences, chose not to do so. Islamic historians who were aware of pre-Islamic Persian religion chose to minimize its contributions to Islamic theology. Jewish scholars who knew about Persian period influences chose to emphasize continuity with earlier Hebrew traditions, rather than acknowledging